Today's chat is brought to you by, well, all of your support. Through the patronage you provide the Focus Fire chat team through Podbean's crowdfunding, we are able to provide you with the weekly podcast as well as the website and other aspects of Focus Fire chat. If you have any interest in becoming a patron of the FFC, please be sure to visit our website and click on the support link. Even a single dollar helps, and for those of you who are already patrons, thank you again for your generosity.
Welcome to Focus Fire Chat. Explore together.
Welcome to Focus Fire Chat, recorded live on March 6, 2020 over on twitch.tv/FocusFireChat as we continue our discussion over world building. This particular episode will serve as what we have come to call the advanced session of the week's exploration. Congratulations to those who signed up for a deeper dive. Before we go any further, however, let's run through a quick introduction of who all we have with us on the show. As always, this is your host, Blue Crew 86.
And this is Green-Eyed Music Lover. No extra names this time.
Yeah, you kind of burned the bridge last week with the whole...
Did I?
With the whole Weblore title.
Did I?
When you were like... I can't even remember. I just remember you were even chat was
It was the whole thing that it was all of Osiris's accolades. So I blame Osiris.
I totally left the blank space after your intro in the podcast. I was like, I'm not even editing this out.
I blame Osiris for the lack of name this week. He has ruined me for you. He is such an old grandpa attacking another old grandpa who happens to be an AI.
Grumpy old man.
Yeah. Grumpy old man part 3.
Destiny. So I mean, like, really, okay, so to continue with this is really, I want to jump into this whole debate about world building and what basically Electrical Literature is the first, is a website that I first see this in, and this is, I believe it's Lincoln Mitchell, I believe, is the author. I want to make sure I get this correct. Yes, Lincoln Mitchell is the one who wrote this. And he does a really, really good presentation of this. And I just scrolled over it. So where did it go? Here it is. Okay. So he has a part on these articles, and I'm going to quote. I'm going to link actually quite a few things in our show notes. So if you have any curiosity where I'm getting all this stuff, you should just visit the Lore Network for the show notes, and you'll see they'll be at the bottom of the show notes. But he has an entire section that's basically called World Building versus World Conjuring, and he goes into this whole thing, and this particular article is titled Against World Building. So to give you an idea of, his overarching theme, it's not a positive theme with regards to world building. It's actually, he's arguing against it. And his problem with it is that he says, my problem is not with non-realist writing, but implying the rules of certain types of science fiction and fantasy to all types and beyond. And so he goes on to say that, most people use the term similar to the idea that world building covers everything and anything inside that world, which includes money, clothing, territorial boundaries, tribal customs, building materials, imports, exports, transportation, sex, food, the various types of monkeys people possess, whether the world does or does not contain satanic twerking rites, which I love that inclusion on there. But so his basic thing is he's not saying he's saying that in this sense, it's not just creating a setting, it's actually fleshing an invented world out completely. And the problem with this is that, it's not realistic. It's not in a perfect. And so basically he goes on to say, in a perfectly executed work of world building, there would be no gaps in the world for the reader to fill. And, everything from the goblin's favorite type of baby wipes to the export taxes on Martian ray guns would be worked out. And that's just not conducive to the way most people write. That's just not, it takes the joy out of writing. So what he goes on to say is he says, in contrast to world building, I offer the term world conjuring. And world conjuring does not attempt to construct a scale model in the reader's bedroom, but it instead uses hints and literary magic to create the illusion of a world with the reader working to fill in the gaps. So whereas world building imposes, world conjuring collaborates, which is where I really like that concept of world conjuring, because that's kind of what we've been talking about a lot. It actually invites your, whether it's the player or the gamer, it invites that person to collaborate with the creator in building the world together. You are part of the connecting of the dots, really. So here, let me see. He goes on to say, let me make a necessarily incomplete analogy to another platform. In painting, world building is like Renaissance art that attempts to create realistic figures even when they are cherubs, demons, or God. World conjuring is a spectrum of other techniques. Matisse implying dancing figures with a few swoops of the brush. Picasso creating a chaos of objects to summon the horrors of Guernica. Magritte shattering our vision with impossible scenes. We should enjoy realistic paintings, but we shouldn't impose their standards on every school of art. And that's where he goes on to say world building is the Silmarillion. World conjuring is ancient myths and fairy tales. I love the example. He's like, in fairy tales, we don't learn the construction techniques of the witch's gingerbread house or the import-export routes of evil dwarves. Which is just,
right,
I love it.
I mean, I think the easiest way to explain it is the world building is giving you all the constructive material that you need to be able to flesh out the world yourself and see it visually and viscally without having any aspect of emotional story tied into it, whereas the creative aspect or the world conjuring is you're only getting the details that are relative to the story that are going to be important, that will at least color the world that you are in to be able to create a visceral world for you to experience.
Yes. He makes the point that all stories may need to conjure a world, but only a few benefit from building one.
Right.
Another way to look at this is like if you've ever read any of the works of Philip K. Dick, very, very short stories. There is no world building in a lot of his stuff because, I mean, some of his stories are only 3 pages long. Right. Some of the most amazing short stories I've ever read. Like, they're really good, but they are standalone stories. There is no other, like, that's kind of part of the allure, is like you're always wanting more. You want to know what's going on, and there's nothing there. So you have to, it's like this thing that sparks that imagination and be like, okay, well, what's going on with this? What happens after that, cliffhanger of an ending? I mean, that's how we got Blade Runner.
Right.
That's how we got Minority Report. That's where those came from. Go for it.
I was just going to say, it kind of comes from the aspect I was talking about in the introduction episode, that jumpstarting creativity is not necessarily from the world building aspect where you're creating every little bit. You know exactly in the world where the bear is going to jump out at the person, versus the aspect of you're telling the story and there's an emotionally appropriate, or there's a story plot appropriate time for the bear to jump out at the person, versus it's just the creativity aspect of creating a world from the what did you say it was? The conjuring aspect of it. The conjuring aspect of it is the more realistic spurt of the moment aspect, right, versus the everything is plot and planted, and it is that railroading aspect that every DM tries to avoid, because, I mean, railroading is totally different in some ways, but at the same time it's very similar to the world building aspect, because if you're going to railroad a story, you're creating every aspect of what's going to happen to these people before they get there, and you're going to decide where they're going before they get to that point, right? That's the whole point of railroading.
Yeah, and as a DM, I can tell you that even if you try to railroad, all you're going to do is piss off your players, and then you won't have a game.
Exactly. So world building and railroading are very similar in the aspect of that you are creating no aspect of discovery for the reader or the player. So conjuring a world, you're creating the aspect of discovery. That is something that players and readers and people who are engaging with the story are drawn to because they feel like they're finding something new. It's not something that is created specifically for them. It's not something handed to them like a freaking ABCD. Like, it's not an alphabet block list that you know exactly where each peg is going to go.
It's a fiction.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's a fiction where their aspects that they're influencing into the story are going to be taken into account so that it's going to change how the story is going to be told.
Yeah, I personally, like, my personal thing is I think actually there's a place for both of these aspects in any story. And the reason I say that is I think I take the concept of world conjuring as that initial writing, like that this is the story, this is the, you know, the hook, the battle, the, you know, the climax of the story, you know, all that's the creative piece. World building is going back once that piece has been done and editing it to make it consistent before you share it. And that's where the world building comes in, because, you know, world building is like, okay, you sit down and you've written this awesome, you know, piece of original, like whatever, or your fan fiction piece, right? You go back and you say, okay, what can I tweak to make this actually, you know, follow XYZ to make it make sense?
It's telling the story first and then building the world second versus building the world first and then telling the story to fit the world.
Correct. Which is where you get in my brain, this is I'll preface this with, this is my brain. That is the big difference between designing a world for telling a story and designing a world for playing a game. Because with playing a game, you're designing the world and then letting someone else really tell the story. Whereas with telling a story, you're telling the story and building the world, because you have to do both at the same time.
Right. I mean, that's the hard aspect of the game, is the fact that there is a concrete direction in which you're heading. Whether it's direction A or direction B, there's still going to be a concrete direction that you're heading. So
there's
there
the
may
illusion
be
of free choice.
Exactly. Versus the actual free choice of being able to kill the chicken versus don't kill the save the widow.
Don't kill the chicken.
I mean, if you're in Fabled, you're going to get attacked by every chicken
Zelda
in the freaking...
will teach you
every chicken in the world. Oh my god, those chickens are brutal. Like, I grew up with chickens. Chickens are pretty docile. Turkeys, on the other hand, will your shit. Turkeys will chase you and corner you on a freaking, like, trailer. I have had this happen. This is a true life story. This sounds
like a story.
This is a real life story. We had a turkey. I don't remember what the turkey's name was, but the turkey chased both my brother and I, who were teasing it. We obviously deserved it. We had a trailer sitting not very far from the chicken coop, which is where the turkey lived, that was literally just the back of a truck. Like, the truck cab was cut off, it was the back of the truck, it had a little hitch to hook up to another truck type thing, and we hid on that thing for about 30 minutes before the turkey finally got bored with us and just left. This is a true story. Turkeys are evil. I'm going to forget about the PG rating. Turkeys, they are much meaner than chickens. Chickens are fine. Anyway.
So the article on Electric Lit, he actually gets in a really good debate with one of the authors from, I believe it is LitHub, which is another Emily Temple. So this is an exchange that happened back in 2017, and it's really good. Like, I liked reading both sides of this, and the best part about it is that they actually were like, they were very invested in their points, but they did not, like, it didn't devolve. Like, it was just like they had their separate opinions, and they were opposed completely. But Emily from LitHub wrote back and was like, look, you're cutting down, the forest to save a tree, basically. Like, that's not what we're saying. You have to do this and this and this, and you have to do, and she's like, she basically kind of does a critique of his article. And her ultimate point is that for her, when you say world building, it means the same thing as world conjuring. World building and world conjuring are the same thing. As with anything else, it's just a matter of tools that you're using, how you're using them, and what kind of castle you're trying to build. I'm like, okay, I can see that. I completely understand that. Even though I personally do agree with Lincoln's point, which then he wrote a response to her response, and this is the one that I really like, because he basically starts. He actually also takes some responses from Twitter, which are hilarious, and devolves into him kind of applying realistic world building to different fantasies that are very popular. One of which is the show The 100, which is, I think, the one where the kids are kicked off the space station or something to sent back to Earth. I think that's the one. Yeah. It's a sci-fi show. I haven't seen it, so I'm not really sure. But anyways, so he's like, all right, so here's the realistic world building version of The 100. The teens are sent to Earth and all die quickly and painfully at the end.
Jeez.
I'm like, he's not wrong. Like he's right. Like, and his point is like, to pick one example of the absurdity of the show, the 100 teens are said to have evolved immunity to the nuclear radiation that instantly kills normal humans, some of who live in nuclear shelter and are primary antagonists one season after 3 generations. Needless to say, that's a little quick for evolution. Indeed, the fact that teenagers are wasteful instead of intelligently saving every scrap might be the single most realistic part of the entire show.
Jeez.
Here's the realistic world building. And then he goes on to say, when we critique a work, and there are plenty of reasons to critique the 100 or Waterworld, we need to do it on the terms of the work itself. Those terms aren't always realism, scientific accuracy, or historical accuracy. And that's the part that I really like, is that you have to, when you're critiquing a fictional world, this is something that's applicable to not just literature, but also, Destiny. We have to do this a lot in Destiny. We have to catch ourselves, and we have to be sure not to critique that based off our world, the non-fiction world. You have to take the suspension of disbelief that is required to exist in the fictional world, and you critique it in the terms of the work itself. That's where the death of the author argument comes in. And so he goes on to say, he's not against world building. He's just not against, or he's against world building, not against science fiction fantasy. Again, going back to what works for one genre, you shouldn't apply to everything. Like, that's just not the way it works. Oh,
sure. Building out, like, Warhammer, for example, there are aspects of Warhammer that if you just started with the...
God.
Warhammer doesn't follow the story of, like, one particular person, right?
No.
It follows the story of different races. There are aspects of one person, right? But you have the aspects of multiple races competing in this world. You have, like, the Space Marines, and I don't remember any of the rest of them, and I'm sure people are going to remind me of the rest of them, but there are aspects of factions fighting against each other. That type of story writing is totally different than dealing with a singular person's story writing, where you're dealing with a singular person's emotions versus the aspect of a culture. Writing for a culture is totally different than writing for a singular person.
Right. And so, like, on that note, he actually pulls a quote from Neuromancer, which is William Gibson. And so Neuromancer was like a huge thing, and they wanted to turn it into a board game. And I'm going to have to censor myself because the quote is, I don't want to censor the quote, but he says, William Gibson's explanation of this conversation was, quote, "They set me down and questioned me about the world. They asked me where the food in the sprawl comes from. And I said, I don't know. I don't even know what they eat. A lot of krill and They looked at each other and said it's not gameable. That was the end of it. The peripheral is not gameable. It has a very high resolution surface, but it is not hyper-realistic down to the bones of some imaginary world. I think it would be pointless. It would be like one of those non-existent Borgsian encyclopedias that describe everything about an imaginary place and all of it is self-contradictory. End quote. So, and that's, again, his point is like, this is a guy who wrote a very successful thing, and they're like, okay, but we need to gamify it. And he's like, I don't know. Like, I don't care. They eat that. Like, sure. I
mean, Sanderson had kind of that aspect because in the Stormlight Chronicles, there's a lot of people who ate essentially the lichen off of rocks for a long time. But I don't know if that was an initial thing that he had discussed way ahead of time or if that was something that came later. But I don't know. It's what is more important to you in your story writing. I think that is the ultimate aspect of what you're doing is what is the most important aspect to you? Is having a hyper-realistic world important to you? In which case you can create the world first before you create the story? Or is creating the emotional story most important to you and then creating the world around it to fit the story?
Right. And he later goes on to quote M.J. Harrison. Wow, I messed that up. Another science fiction author where they actually basically say the same thing that we've kind of been saying too is, world building is dull. World building literalizes the urge to invent. World building gives an unnecessary permission for acts of writing, indeed for acts of reading. World building numbs the reader's ability to fulfill their part of the bargain because it believes that it has to do everything around here if anything is going to get done. Above all, world building is not technically necessary. It is the great clomping foot of nerdism. It is the attempt to exhaustively survey a place that isn't there. A good writer would never try to do that, even with a place that is there. End quote.
Now, to be fair, as far as the other side of that coin is, if you have a world that you have in your mind of there are certain rules that things must follow, and you're able to create a story of a singular point in that comes from it, part of me wonders if that's where Tolkien was when it comes to like the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings in general.
Right. But I mean, because so even there though, you're using logic. You're keeping the logic within that. You're building that world, but you're conjuring it as you need it. So you're explaining things as you're doing it.
Did he, though? Because there are aspects in the Silmarillion that aren't necessarily relative to the world itself. There's no point in knowing some of the older gods of the world in which Lord of the Rings takes place. The world-building aspect is literally just an extemporary aspect of the story. There's no point in knowing all the different gods that came forth, all the different types of elves that came forth prior to any of the story that is relative to Frodo going and dumping the ring into Mordor, or dumping the ring into Khazad-dûm. There's no point in that, in creating all that different aspect, unless he just had that just floating around in his head prior to, I don't know, there's aspects of it.
I mean, to kind of take a step out and look at how that worked. The Silmarillion, for the regards to The Hobbit, was written first. Like, he wrote The Hobbit well before that.
And then he wrote the Lord of the Rings as his sons got older.
Well, yes and no. So, like, he had Silmarillion bouncing around in his head because after The Hobbit, he had sent. So after The Hobbit came out and it was a success, the publisher actually came back to Tolkien and was like, hey, we want to do a sequel. And he sent them an early copy of what he had of the Silmarillion, and they rejected it because they were like, no, this is not, like, this isn't, because it was basically a history text, like what we've been talking about.
It's really bland. It's hard to read.
It's extremely difficult to read, and it's kind of like unless you have the backdrop of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it's kind of hard to keep track of what's going on. Like, even with the backdrop of The Lord of the Rings, it's hard to keep track on some parts of it. But that's actually where he then was like, okay, fine. Then he started writing the first chapter of Lord of the Rings for them as the sequel. But like, there are parts of the Silmarillion that he didn't complete. Like, there are, and they weren't published until well after. So they were basically like his
finished it.
Yeah, the Silmarillion was basically like his notes to keep himself consistent as he wrote The Lord of the Rings. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't really directly tie into the overarching canonical story of Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but it is secondary to tertiary connections to then other characters that are instrumental in those stories, or they lead up to those stories happening. That ultimately they do connect. It's just that there might not be a direct connection. It might be a bit of a winding road that connects it, but they do drive parts that then will drive the story.
Right. There's stories. I mean, the story of Gandalf kind of threads through a lot of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
But as far as I don't know, it's just, as far as a writer getting ready to write a story, creating a world versus creating a story first, because those are two very different things. If you are most comfortable with designing a world, design a world. Do that.
Yes.
If you are most comfortable with writing a story where there are connections emotionally with one or two people, or just however you decide to write a story versus off of the perspective of the people, write the story first and then design the world around it and flesh out how the world looks. For me personally, that's how I write. I literally come up with one hook and then I start writing. I don't come up with anything else until I start writing with somebody else, because this is going to get more into the freeform aspect, which we're going to get into here in a little bit. But when you're writing with somebody else and you have the one aspect, things that they feed back to you is going to flavor how you react, because you're going to realize how that character reacts while the other person is bouncing those ideas off of you. So if you are a writer or want to be a writer, figure out what you enjoy doing most and go that route. I know we're talking a lot about designing the story first, because that is what works for a lot of people. But if you are one who wants to design where every bear sits in the world, or how the economy works, or how the religion works, or how the creation story works, great, do that. But if you're wanting to connect to another person out there when you're writing your story, write a story that is emotionally connected to the people that you are trying to connect to, because you're writing to an audience. You're not writing to a history, you're writing to an audience of one.
Yeah, and I think the good tie-in there is the article from Guy, where he talks about the player story. And Guy says, the cake is the narrative that we've designed. The player story is how each player will eat the cake. No matter how you are designing the narrative experience, the player will experience moment after moment in a linear way at their own pace. So obviously Guy is talking about a game here. I have always found it challenging to explain to people why this moment works at that time, but at another time it doesn't. Saying it doesn't feel right isn't enough. Beyond what feels right, there is a structure. And so he actually breaks down, 3-act structure, and then he challenges that, and he says, while we should not be following the hero's journey to the letter, there are pieces that you can take away from it. And so he actually goes further and shows a way of breaking down the traditional 3 acts into, I think he does 17. He does the 17 point. So like there's like commonly there is a 7, 12, 17, or 22 part story, depending on how complex you want to get. But the one that he uses is the 17 point. There are 17 beats. And then he showed, it's Guy's article it's really easy. It's really quick read, but it's fascinating because he shows like the curve of the interest curve, which is a concept in game design that, you know, shows the correlation between interest and time, which is really, really cool. And then like he has a couple clips from, or a couple screenshots from a GDC conversation in which the creator of, I believe it's Journey, shows how he used this exact curve to create, or the creative director of Journey, he uses this to do the developing of the story of Journey. Like, and so it's just like really cool watching his presentation of this and his explanation of this. And he goes, you know, he explains, I think he has he does a video of the emotional journey of Player Underground's battle. What is it? PUBG. He actually breaks down the fight scenes on PUBG into this narrative. So like even in open world like PUBG, you know, he makes the point that the circles limiting the play space during the game is the mechanism that, you know, will create that narrative drive to provide an emotional experience for the player. And it does. Like, I mean, if you've ever played a battle royale game, that's exactly what it does. But yeah, so I'm gonna link this article, but definitely if you don't read any of the other articles, read this one. Like, he does an amazing job with this article.
I would encourage you to read this one and then immediately go turn around and read the Black Armory papers.
Yes, I can see that.
Did you read those back to back? Because
I read them back to back. Yeah.
Yeah, because they are absolutely 100% a word for word of what he's saying in there. Because Black Armory papers, not only are they just literally 18 pages of lore, he narrows them down to just 18 pages, period, 18 entries. They are exactly what he's talking about when in this article on how you design the arc of a story and how you connect the story to the player. It's really nice to see. Really nice to see somebody. This is the art of story writing at this point, rather than just
but I mean writing. that is also building the world. You know, is telling the story within the world. And, you know, actually, I'm going to use that as a segue to unleash the green on Freeform, like how that piece kind of plays into this whole thing, because we have been talking about building a world that is predominantly from a single point of view, right? I think you've mentioned this. But, you know, to reiterate, we have been focusing on worlds that, you know, one person is controlling the whole thing. So how does that differ from a world in which multiple people are responsible for creation?
There's a difference in so much as a lot of the times in a world where it's free form, and I'm speaking mainly from the role-playing aspect of play-by-post, in so much as the rules of the world are already established. Now, there can be bending of the rules that happened in that world. So say if you're playing Second Life, if you're doing writing for roleplay for Destiny in general, which is what I've done primarily as Petra, you play by the rules of what that character can do, or you play by the rules of what goes on in that world. Characters, certain, like Guardians are able to do this, and various characters are able to do this. Well, you want to be able to flex those roles a little bit. So sometimes, like Petra in particular, Petra has training in the Techian personality or Techian roles. So there are some things that I have played with in my writing specifically that Petra has been able to do some of those lift aspects that you get with the Techians when you're in like the Last Wish raid, where Shiro will lift you up and like launch you into the air. Well, Petra has had those abilities via in the roleplay because there is a preconceived notion that she's able to do that in the world because she has this training with the Techians, even though the Techians in Last Wish are taken. When you're writing in a group specifically like that, there are give and takes that you have with any sort of writing, and most of the play-by-post are fairly short and descriptive, and both people are describing the scene. Not one person is describing where you're at. So say I'm writing that Petra is sitting in the Dreaming City inside of the palace. She's inside of the common room. There's a fireplace. She's sitting on a couch-like situation. The couch is leather. I'm describing the scene and where she's at. And then the other person immediately picks up where they're at in their own perspectives, whether it's a guardian or Mara Sov or somebody like that. They describe where they're at in perspective to where Petra is at. So both players are creating the scene together. So Petra is sitting on a couch. Say, for instance, Mara Sov is sitting on a different couch within the same room. This couch is a little bit more ornate. It is specifically hers. It's closer to the fireplace. Different aspects she can describe herself. And then the characters have these conversations. So you can design the world together and design the scenes. And what's interesting about freeform play is that the story revolves around the cooperative sense of what's going on. There generally is somewhat of a leader that happens when it comes to the conflict of the story, but each person is able to affect the outcome of the story in the long run. So, for instance, one of the most drawing stories that I've ever had as far as writing is there was a scene within the Tangled Shore, and a character who had basically attacked and kidnapped another player's ghost, stole the ghost into this bar-like scene, and not only Petra, but another guardian all interacted together to try to get this ghost back. And so we were describing aspects of the bar as well as the fight scene that was going on. So there is a give and take that happens, and yes, there are some, I would call the Superman moments, where there are things that are like the heroic moments that stand out for each player, but it is on each player to be cognizant enough to rein in their own abilities to know realistically of what their character can and cannot do, as well as add faults to their own character. There are faults that I've added into what Petra can do, or Petra's reactions to things, that flavor not only the story or how we interact with each other. Petra has a really hard time of developing relationships besides with her relationship with Mara Sov, or she has this kind of almost hero worship of Mara Sov because of everything that's gone on in her life with the Rays of Amethyst and the Death Azure, and Petra finding that colors how the character develops, which is very interesting in writing in a world that is already developed versus writing in a world that has not been developed. So freeform works a little better, I think, in a world that's already been developed, at least in some extent, versus a world that has not been developed at all. But you can write with your DM group or your D&D group. You can create the story together. I've done that as well. It's not nearly as easy as having some pre-established rules as far as freeform, but I don't know, Blue, what's your experience with that?
I don't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Really? You really don't? You don't go anywhere near freeform?
No. I like the structure of, I have not, to be fair, the only person that I have ever had a successful freeform interaction with was my wife. She had a group that they played on Play-by-Post back when we were in college, and it was a very short-lived story, which is probably why it worked, because there was there's just, I have never interacted with a group of people that tend to respect the not God moding thing. And it's just frustrating. It's just one of those things where it's like, I see every time I get into a freeform environment, I'm like, yep, this is why we have rules. Like, this is why we rely on dice.
I mean, I will tell you this much. I have gotten onto one of the other freeform writers before for it's not necessarily god moding, which is the quote unquote term for it, but basically assigning something that's happening to another character without consent of the other character. Because anytime you assign, oh my gosh, it drove me freaking nuts. And this is a year ago now that this has happened, and it still drives me crazy. Anytime you assign something that's happening to multiple characters, but you don't consent the other character, that's a big no-no in freeform play. You have to get the consent of other players while you're writing this freeform story in order to make sure it works. Because if you decide that, hey, I'm going to write this story and your character's pregnant, but you don't know that, that's a big no-no. Just don't do that. But,
yeah. And like, I guess coming from multiple year experience of like very structured tabletop for like the group that I always played tabletop with, we would do freeform theater. Like we would role play more than we would like hack and slash in our games. But the underlying logic was always, if a dispute broke out, we had the underlying, okay, now we can go back to the dice, and we have a structure to settle the argument. Whereas like in the free, and this is fully, just my experience, but like within the freeform environments that I have interacted with, when that inevitable argument comes up, there's nothing to rely on that is like consistently everyone agrees that it's an impartial system. Like regardless of quote if your dice is lucky or not, you can complain all you want, but the dice is the dice. Like
I think it depends on the group, really.
It 100% does. It 100% does.
Because I've had really good experiences with groups who have decided this is going to be like, everybody knows the outcome of what the situation is going to be. There's an obvious bad guy. There's an obvious good guy. There's an obvious way that this is going to head. And at some point, whether or not we get there at the same time as everybody or not. So say, for instance, back in that bar scene, there was an obvious bad guy who had stolen the ghost, who was at the bar in the Tangled Shore that Petra was pissed off about, and this other guardian was pissed off about, and we were going to go kick that guardian's or that Dredgen's butt, essentially, is what it was. So bad Dredgen, a guardian, and a Petra. So Guardian Petra attack the Dredgen, and there's instances, there were things in the story that coalesced that was not necessarily what we were expecting. It wasn't just a clean cut, oh, the Guardian wins or the Petra wins. It wasn't as easy as that, but there were aspects where things didn't go exactly as according to plan. But in the end, the Guardian was able to get its ghost back. Petra was able to help in some way, shape, or form, and the Dredgen in question was eliminated. So there are certain story plot points that are not necessarily predetermined, but at least understood within when you're writing the story, that makes it easier. And that's something to discuss with when you're doing this freeform story play, because you don't want to create a situation where there are multiple actors who want to be the hero of their own story, and that story isn't necessarily able to be fulfilled because you have too many heroes and not enough villains, quote unquote, or too many conflicts and not enough resolutions. So freeform can be pretty difficult unless you have a group that is willing to work together.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the other question is, like, for me, the question that stands out immediately was, like, in that situation, was that villain another player? Or was it an NPC that was agreed upon?
That Ironically, the villain in that story was not somebody who had talked to both of the characters ahead of time, but already understood that that was their role in the situation.
Okay, so it was another player. Yeah, okay, so I mean,
Correct.
again, from a logistics standpoint, your experience is highlighting the fact that the group of people was much more cooperative.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, and so I just haven't had that experience. And now, going to current situations, I don't have the time to dedicate to free, because freeform takes a significant amount of time. I mean, geez. Role playing games in general take a significant amount of time. But yeah, and it's like growing into that space, like even when we did play by post, like especially when we did play by post because it was digital, regardless of if we ever used it, having that underlying structure of a character sheet there just in case we needed it, because that was the other thing. A lot of play by posts that we played, I wouldn't consider them freeform. Looking back, they probably were pretty freeform because they were very role play heavy. But the reason I wouldn't consider them is because if a crisis arose and that we needed to settle a dispute, it wasn't a matter of who wrote better. It was a matter of, let's roll a dice and see where it goes. It's just it's just the deference of that particular dispute, that particular argument.
But if you take it in the form of like tabletop RPGs, what essentially freeform can become is the aspect of there is a DM or there is a GM who plays the bad guy or who plays the conflict in the situation, because that's what DMs do, right? In a situation of tabletop RPGs, if the player characters were the ones in charge all the time, there wouldn't be any conflicts. They would just constantly be partying, drinking in the bar, and enjoying life. But the DM is the one who creates the conflict. So people who play freeform RPGs, who do these play-by-post or online RPs, there generally is an either unspoken or spoken agreement that there is a player who is kind of directing the conflict of the situation. Once that the conflict can be approached by other player characters in whatever way they see fit, and the conflict creator is the one who's going to react to it. So that's the freeform aspect of it. There is always going to be the conflict and resolution aspect, but how the players devise it and create the setting of it is up to the players in general. Everybody works together in that aspect of it. Right. I can basically have Petra lift up the character and throw them up against the ceiling because of the Techian aspect if I want to, because of the preconceived rules of the world in which that we are playing in with Destiny. But the design of the bar setting and everything like that may be determined on the conflict creator in the situation. And every good story has conflict and resolution. Depending on who is creating the conflict or who is creating the resolution, it could be either freeform, where you have multiple people creating that, where you have one person creating the conflict and one person the resolution, like in tabletop gaming or freeform gaming, or you can have it contained within the same unit, where it's a single source unit, where the writer is creating both the conflict and the resolution in their own aspect of how they are describing it, or their own world creation at that point.
Yeah, I think, yes.
Did I just pull a blue?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think the thing is like again, basically with freeform, you have to have players who have the maturity to be both DM and PC, which that's a high ask, because it's a tough gig, which probably, again, that explains why I have not experienced a cohesive freeform. Like I wouldn't say not a good one. I've had fun freeforms, but it just always devolves because there's always, it's just without fail, there's always the one person who either it's a Napoleon complex or, you know, the God mode, like, you know, just, they have to be the hero. Like, and it's always like, okay, well, we can counteract and, you know, logically do this. No, I win. It's like,
yeah,
you know, at that point, it's just like, whatever, this game's over. Like, as soon as you get that mentality in a freeform game, you're just going to walk away.
But that's the fun part about creating a cooperative story. You have to be willing to be the monster, but you have to be a fair monster in the storytelling aspect, which is not always easy.
It's not at all.
No, because nobody wants to lose. But being a DM or being a GM when you're creating a story is all about creating a situation in which your player characters can win.
Right, because I think that's ultimately the difference, right? Is being a DM it's not about winning or losing. It's about, do you succeed in telling a story?
Right. But
which go for it.
There are DMs who are so consumed with the numbers aspect.
Yes.
Of creating the story that the story gets lost in the technical side of creating the situation.
I can't stand those types of DMs.
And I've played that before, and it's not exactly fun.
Oh, it's stressful. It's just, yeah.
I mean, but that's the balance you have to walk. That's the line you have to walk when you're creating a story, if you're creating a tabletop story in particular, because you're not only creating the situation in which players can express themselves in ways that make them feel powerful or heroic or however their character is going to react. Some characters like to be the charisma-driven character and going to be the ones who are going to charm the monster into giving up. I mean, there are different ways that DMs have to react, and creating a situation purely based off of numbers is the same thing we were talking about with the world building. Having the numbers and having the structure there is great. But if that's all you're depending on, the story remains flat.
Right. World building is a crutch, and it's not necessarily bad or good, but if it can be misused, and if it is misused, then it's a negative crutch. But if it's used correctly, it can be a very powerful support.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's the thing, is like, for me, that's the way I view it. Is like, that's why I kind of gravitate towards that structure, is not because I want to play, because I can't stand games that are 100% hack and slash. They bore me. It's like, I mean, it's just, I mean, I think that would be anybody. It's like, oh my God, just because it's just like move 5 steps. I mean, at that point, you're playing a glorified game of chess.
Right.
Nothing against glorified games of chess. I mean, whatever. If that's your thing, cool. It's just not mine. But the reason why that I like it is because there's that social security blanket, I guess would be the best way, of like, if there is a dispute, it's just an impartial judge that's just there all the time.
Right.
And it keeps people in line, really, more than anything.
It's somebody discovered something on the way to this place. Roll a die to see what they discovered.
Yes.
If they roll high, you discover something, a little bit more information that's going to guide you. If they roll low, it's so benign that it doesn't matter. I mean, that's the
unless
point
you're
of
me,
art.
and then you just really jack with your players at that point.
Right, and our tabletop RPGs can be this, that, and the other, but when it comes to telling the story, you're telling a story based off of the experience of the players. When you're rolling dice, the dice are there to help create the probability in which they succeed, because creating the impartiality or the ability to mitigate the God mode that a lot of players like to take advantage of, because who doesn't want to be a hero? Because everybody wants to be a hero of their own story. It helps direct the story in a way that twists and turns develop because of the terrible rolls that end up happening.
Some of the best stories are because of terrible rolls.
Oh, yeah. And that's the whole point of creativity, right? Like,
oh, yeah.
Creativity isn't born of exceptional situations. Creativity is born of situations that aren't exceptional. I was listening to a TED radio hour Julie had it on her podcast the other night when we were going to bed, and this gentleman who was very adamant about playing on you had to have a perfectly in tune grand piano that had to be this, and this, right? He was a jazz musician. He had to have all of these different things. And he got to this situation where there was not a grand piano. There was not all these different things that he had expected. Not everything was going the way he had wanted it to. And he had to play. Like, there was no ifs, ands, thens, or buts about it. He had to end up playing. And what ended up coming out of the concert, because of the difficulty, or quote-unquote difficulty, of having a piano that wasn't exactly what he wanted or not exactly in tune, he created the most downloaded, most consumed jazz album of all time because of the quote-unquote difficulty that he had in the situation, because he was able to let go of these preconceived notions of this is how it's supposed to be. I'm going to make it what I want it to be.
Adaptability. It's pretty amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. What do you think, Blue?
I think it's a good wrap. Again, I'm going to put the links to all the articles that I had kind of dug up, that I personally have, that I dug up in addition to some of the stuff. Like, there's a really good, for those who are interested in it, there is a really good, it's called Sample Questions When World Building, and it's from, let me make sure I get this right. It's from I want to say it's Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America website, by Patricia Reed. This is, I don't know how long this thing's been around, since like 2009. So this is like basic, like, again, this is not meant to be a checkbox, but it's a good thing to kind of look over, because it's got some really cool questions that might actually spark some ideas, which is actually what I love doing with world building questions, is like, because a lot of world building questions, like, what do you do every morning? I'm like, I don't care. Like, move on. But this one's got some fun ones. This one, let me open this one up real quick, because they have it where it's like, it'll come, you can get it in a PDF or whatever. But they have like the world, like the overarching planet, and it's like, for a planet that's not Earth at all, they have a subsection here, and it's like, how are the continents laid out? Is there more than one moon or sun? How does this affect winds, tides, and weather generally? Okay, that's not really useful. Are there non-human inhabitants of this planet? Wow, planet. If so, how numerous, how openly present, what areas do they occupy? Okay, so that's a cool question, because then, you can start thinking about, like, okay, let's take Tolkien, like the Hobbit. Hobbits are non-human. They don't, they're not openly present. Why is it? Why do they do that? What areas do they occupy? To me, this is what I do, is I'll just scroll through these things, and I'm like, oh, that's a cool question. Let's think about what would that take for that to work, or how does that fit into this or this, which is what I use a lot of these like resources for. I don't use them as probably what they were intended to be used, but they're useful to me for that purpose. So I'll link that in there, and then the conversation around the dangers of world building, like I had mentioned, from Electric Lit and LitHub. I'll include those. Brief intro to world building from WordPress. There's a WordPress that I have. It's pretty good at build out there. There's the Right Life. They have an intro guide to how to world build, and then obviously Guy's narrative design essays, which I would recommend strongly. If you have not read those, definitely read those. They're very quick reads. They are very easy reads, and they are very, very, very informative reads. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the big thing to remember when you're writing a story is have your tiny little hook of what you want to start with, and just start writing. The questions that Blue has for the world building aspect of it, can come in as you're writing the big story. But the thing that most people need to remember, unless you're writing an epic where it's devolved into races versus races, or civilizations versus civilizations, stories are about people. Stories are not about groups generally. And if you have the story built off the people, then you can build off the world based off of those people and their experiences. So the world building aspect can come off of what your said character can do or experiences in real life. Like if what does Frodo experience when he first wakes up in the morning? Or what is his experience when he goes into this land or whatnot? Those world building aspects are based off of his personal experiences, and having the personal experiences of the singular player or the singular aspect of the story is most important, because that is the person or the character in which you want your reader to relate to, or possibly even the villain aspect relate to. So build your world off of their perspectives, not necessarily the entire world's perspective, but the perspectives of the characters that are relevant to your story. Period.
Yep. I think that is an excellent point and an excellent place to end. So, Green, do you have any additional shout-outs for us this week?
Shout-outs to any aspiring writers. I actually have a writer friend who wrote a book based off the Portrait of Dorian Gray. That is a cross-gender version of it, which is kind of a fun, different thing. So if you go into the aspect of world writing or developmental writing, it is flipping it on its head, doing the gender bent version of it like that. Feel free to read that. It is, I'm trying to remember the name of it, and I don't, but by Molly Tanzer. It's, oh gosh, I've totally blanked on the name of it. I'll probably give it to Blue so he can put it in show notes, but finding an aspect that you want to write about, whether or not it is based off of a classical book or a story that you want to tell, find that story, find that hook, start writing. Even if you don't come up with a giant story to begin with, continue writing, bounce it off of other people. You'll never know what's going to happen. So aspiring writers out there, do not give up. Do not throw your writings into a Google Docs and forget about them. Bounce them off of other people, because you never know what's going to hook. And that is the big thing when it comes to writing, is finding that hook that resonates with other people. So do not be afraid to share your writings, whether it's on websites that you don't expect it to get any sort of traction on, or Twitter or Discords. Feel free to put that stuff out there, because you never know what's going to resonate with other people.
Indeed. And that's actually, I can't end it better myself. So I'm just going to roll into thank you for your time. And until next time, remember, with wisdom we conquer, stand strong, stand tall, and keep exploring. With that, we'll begin to wrap the chat up. Thank you again to those over on Twitch for coming to spend your evening with us. If you'd like to join us for the live streaming of the episodes, please be sure to give us a follow over on twitch.tv/FocusedFireChat. Links to all our episode archives can be found at www.thelorenetwork.com. Please be sure to email us at focusedfirechat@gmail.com with any comments and or questions for the team concerning the podcast, and let us know how we're doing by giving us some feedback and a rating over on iTunes as well. So until next time, focus your fire and may your light shine bright.